What would you do if one morning, without warning, your neighborhood's HOA decided your property was suddenly theirs to control? Ethan Caldwell never thought much about the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association. Why would he? His family's 10-acre estate had stood on the outskirts of town for over a century, long before the manicured lawns and cookie-cutter houses of Oak Ridge sprouted up around it. His land was private, a legacy passed down through generations, and unlike the rest of the neighborhood, it didn't fall under the jurisdiction of any HOA. That was an indisputable fact. But as he stood at his kitchen window that morning, watching a woman in a crisp white blouse and high heels march purposefully up his gravel driveway, he had the uneasy feeling that someone was about to challenge that fact. Ethan stepped onto his porch as she approached, the heels of her expensive shoes clicking sharply against the stones. Even before she spoke, he could tell what kind of person she was, someone used to getting her way, someone who thrived on authority. Without so much as an introduction, she stopped in front of him and announced, "I'm Karen Woods, president of the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association. I'm here about your property's compliance with our landscaping regulations." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Good morning to you too. Can I help you with something?" Karen folded her arms, scanning the hedges that lined the front of his estate. "I'm afraid your greenery doesn't meet the HOA's aesthetic standards. The hedges are overgrown, and they create an unsightly disruption in the community's visual harmony. I'll need you to trim them immediately." Ethan stared at her, momentarily speechless. He had always taken pride in maintaining his property, and while the hedges were a little fuller than usual, they were neatly shaped, enhancing the historic charm of the estate. More importantly, this woman had no right to tell him what to do on land that wasn't under her control. "I appreciate your concern," he said evenly, "but my property isn't part of the HOA. This land predates Oak Ridge and has always remained independent." Karen's smile tightened. "That's irrelevant. Your property is within the community's boundaries, and all properties within Oak Ridge must adhere to HOA regulations. We can't allow exceptions." Ethan's patience thinned. "It's not an exception. It's a legal fact. I have the original deed that proves this land is private and not subject to HOA governance." Karen's eyes flashed with something between irritation and amusement, as if she had dealt with this sort of non-compliance before and considered it more of an inconvenience than a valid argument. "That's what you think," she said coolly. "We'll have our legal team review it, but in the meantime, I expect you to comply. You have 1 week." With that, she pivoted on her heel and strode back down the driveway, leaving Ethan standing on his porch, gripping the railing, his jaw clenched. He had dealt with bureaucratic nonsense before, but something about this woman's confidence, her sheer audacity, didn't sit right with him. Karen wasn't bluffing. She wasn't going to back down. And that meant neither could he. The next morning, Ethan awoke to find a bright orange violation notice nailed to his front gate. The bold, capitalized letters declared that his property was in direct violation of Oak Ridge Homeowners Association standards and that failure to comply within 7 days would result in a fine of $10,000. Ethan ripped the paper off the wood, his pulse ticking like a slow-burning fuse. This had to be a joke. The HOA had no legal claim over his land, yet here they were, acting as if they owned it. Grabbing his phone, he dialed the number at the bottom of the notice, barely suppressing his frustration as the HOA's automated answering system looped him through a maze of robotic options. After an agonizing wait, a familiar voice finally came on the line. "Oak Ridge Homeowners Association, this is Karen Woods." "Karen, this is Ethan Caldwell. I just found an illegal violation notice nailed to my property. I've already explained that my land isn't under your jurisdiction. This is trespassing." Karen let out a small, patronizing laugh. "Mr. Caldwell, I warned you. Your hedges remain non-compliant, and our community standards must be upheld. As I stated, our legal team is reviewing your property status, but in the meantime, I suggest you comply. It would save you a lot of trouble." Ethan gripped the phone tighter. This is harassment. If I see another one of your so-called notices on my property, I'll be the one taking legal action. Karen didn't seem fazed. Do what you feel you need to, Mr. Caldwell. But you should know, resisting the HOA never ends well for anyone. She hung up before he could respond. That was the moment Ethan knew this wasn't just about some overgrown hedges. Karen wanted control. And she wasn't going to stop until she had it. By that evening, Ethan had installed new security cameras around his property. If Karen or anyone from the HOA set foot on his land again, he'd have proof. He also called his lawyer, Maddie Harper, updating her on the situation. You did the right thing, Maddie assured him. But don't expect her to back off. Karen's the type who escalates when she doesn't get her way. Document everything. Maddie was right. 2 mornings later, Ethan heard the rumble of an engine outside. When he stepped onto his porch, a landscaping crew in HOA-branded uniforms was unloading equipment in front of his gate. A man holding a clipboard, presumably the foreman, waved at him as if this was a routine appointment. Ethan stormed down the steps. What the hell do you think you're doing? The foreman sighed. We have an HOA work order to bring your property into compliance. Ethan crossed his arms. I didn't hire you, and my land isn't part of the HOA. Pack up your things and leave. The foreman hesitated. Sir, we're just following orders. Says here we're to trim the hedges, remove the unauthorized trellis, and clear any visible clutter. Ethan's jaw locked. The trellis they were referring to was a handcrafted heirloom built by his grandfather decades ago. Absolutely not, he said firmly. This is private property. If you or your crew so much as touch a branch, I'll have you arrested for trespassing. The foreman exchanged glances with his workers. Karen must not have warned them they'd be illegally working on private land. Without much protest, they packed up their tools and left. Ethan exhaled, thinking the ordeal was over. It wasn't. That afternoon, he found another letter taped to his front door, this time with more aggressive language. The HOA accused him of obstructing community-mandated improvements and threatened further fines and legal action. Ethan immediately called Maddie. They're trying to bury you in fake violations, she said. This is a classic intimidation tactic. You need to document everything, and I mean everything. I want pictures of that letter, timestamps, security footage, whatever you have. Ethan took her advice seriously, meticulously compiling every piece of evidence. 2 days later, Karen made her next move. When Ethan returned home from a quick grocery run, he found a massive pile of tree trimmings, leaves, and broken branches dumped directly in the middle of his driveway. The mess was so large that he couldn't even pull his truck into his own property. His first instinct was to check the security footage. And sure enough, the same HOA landscaping crew had been on his property again that morning, without permission. Furious, Ethan confronted one of his neighbors, an elderly man out walking his dog. Did you see who did this? The man nodded grimly. Saw those HOA landscapers here an hour ago. They were laughing about it. Seemed like someone sent them just to cause trouble. Ethan's hands curled into fists. This wasn't incompetence. This was deliberate. Enough was enough. Without another second of hesitation, Ethan marched straight to the Oak Ridge HOA office. Inside, Karen sat behind a sleek mahogany desk, clicking away at her keyboard. She looked up, feigning surprise as he entered. Mr. Caldwell, she greeted, flashing that insincere, polished smile. What a surprise. Ethan didn't waste time. Cut the act, Karen. Your crew trespassed on my land, again. They vandalized my property and dumped debris in my driveway. I've had enough. Karen leaned back in her chair, tapping a manicured fingernail against her clipboard. I'm sorry to hear that, Ethan. But as I've already told you, your property falls under our jurisdiction, and landscaping adjustments were necessary. Ethan slammed a folder onto her desk, startling her. Inside were copies of his property deed, legal documents confirming his exemption from the HOA, printed photos of the damage caused by her landscapers, and screenshots of the security footage. This is proof that my land is private, and your HOA has no authority here. You're harassing me, and you're breaking the law. Karen's confident mask cracked for just a second, but she quickly recovered, pushing the folder aside. I'll have our legal team review this. Ethan scoffed. Like hell you will. Karen's lips curled into a smirk. You're making this much harder than it needs to be, Ethan. If you just complied, this would all go away. Ethan narrowed his eyes. That wasn't a warning. It was a threat. He turned on his heel and left, seething. He knew one thing for certain, Karen wasn't going to stop. And if she thought she could break him, she was dead wrong. Ethan drove home with his grip tight on the steering wheel, his mind racing. Karen had made it clear, she wasn't backing down. But neither was he. She had underestimated him, thinking she could intimidate him into compliance. That was her first mistake. The moment he got back to his estate, he went straight to work. He spent hours gathering every piece of evidence he had, photos, letters, security footage, timestamps, everything that proved the HOA's harassment, trespassing, and illegal fines. Then, he expanded his investigation. Over the next few days, he started knocking on doors, speaking with neighbors, asking if they had ever dealt with similar tactics from Karen and the HOA. What he uncovered was worse than he expected. Nearly everyone had a story. One neighbor, an elderly woman named Ellie Bennett, had been fined $500 for planting roses in her own front yard because they didn't match the approved landscaping color scheme. Another, a young couple, Jake and Emily Thompson, had been forced to repaint their house twice because the HOA changed its color requirements mid-year without notice. Then there was a man who had been ordered to remove the basketball hoop in his driveway, not because of a rule, but because Karen personally didn't like how it looked. Ethan compiled their statements, documenting every detail. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for every person in Oak Ridge who had been bullied into submission. Then, he took it a step further. He reached out to a local journalist, Tom Grayson, who had a reputation for exposing corruption in community politics. When Ethan showed him the evidence, Tom's eyes darkened with interest. "This is big," Tom said. "You're telling me this woman has been running an HOA like a dictatorship, targeting homeowners with bogus fines, and overstepping legal boundaries?" Ethan nodded. "And she's not stopping. She's trying to force me under HOA control even though my land isn't part of it." Tom sat back, considering. "All right. I want to run this story. But I need more documents, photos, any witnesses willing to go on record." Ethan gave him everything. It was only a matter of time before Karen's power trip became public knowledge. But before Ethan could see the article hit the press, Karen struck back first. The morning after his meeting with Tom, Ethan walked outside to find something far worse than another violation notice. A foreclosure notice, plastered across his gate in bold red letters, stating that his property was to be put up for auction due to unpaid HOA fines. Ethan's vision went red. This was illegal. His property wasn't even under the HOA's jurisdiction, yet Karen had manufactured enough fabricated violations to claim he owed over $50,000 in unpaid dues. He stormed inside, called Maddie, and in less than 10 minutes, they were in a conference call with a judge. Maddie didn't waste time with pleasantries. "This is an egregious abuse of power," she stated. "Karen Woods has no legal authority over my client's property, and this attempt to foreclose on his home is outright fraud. We are filing an immediate cease and desist order." The judge agreed. Within 24 hours, the notice was legally revoked, but Ethan knew this wasn't over. Karen had just declared all-out war. That night, Ethan checked his security cameras, only to find something that sent a fresh wave of anger rolling through him. Someone had disabled them. The footage cut off at exactly 2:14 a.m., and the last thing it showed was a figure wearing an HOA-branded jacket walking toward his front gate. The next morning, Ethan found his front gate spray-painted with the words, "Comply or Pay." The HOA was no longer just playing by their usual rules of intimidation. Now, they were outright vandalizing his property. Ethan filed a police report immediately. Officer Vanessa Carter, who had dealt with HOA disputes before, took the matter seriously. "If this was Karen's doing," she said, reviewing the security footage, "she's crossed into criminal behavior. If you catch her or her people trespassing again, call us right away." Ethan didn't have to wait long. 2 days later, he found a pile of old furniture, broken wooden planks, and rusted metal dumped at the far end of his property. Then, like clockwork, another violation notice arrived. This one accused him of having unauthorized waste on his land and demanded its immediate removal, or face additional fines. Ethan couldn't even make this up. The HOA had dumped garbage on his land, just to fine him for it. That was the final straw. Ethan drove straight to the HOA office. When he pushed open the doors, Karen barely looked up from her desk, her smug expression still intact. "Mr. Caldwell," she purred. "You seem upset." Ethan slammed his folder of evidence onto her desk. "This is everything. Every single illegal fine, every violation notice, every security photo, and every police report. I've had it, Karen. This isn't about the community. This is about you and your ego." Karen's smirk didn't falter. "Careful, Ethan. That sounds an awful lot like slander." "Oh, don't worry," Ethan said, voice calm but lethal. "I'll let the court decide that." For the first time, Karen's confidence wavered. "Court?" Ethan folded his arms. "You've harassed me. You've trespassed on my land. You've vandalized my property. You tried to illegally foreclose my home. And now, I have a lawyer, a police report, and a journalist all waiting to burn your HOA to the ground." Karen's smug expression flickered, just for a second. "I suggest you start preparing," Ethan added, his voice like steel. "Because this time, you picked the wrong person to mess with." He turned and walked out, not waiting for her response. He already knew the war had just begun. Ethan knew Karen wouldn't go down without a fight. She had built her reign over Oakridge through intimidation, deception, and sheer force of will. Now that he had backed her into a corner, she was bound to lash out in a final, desperate attempt to maintain control. That moment arrived 3 days later when he received a formal summons to an HOA compliance hearing. The document, printed on the association's official letterhead, ordered him to appear before the board to address his continued refusal to follow community regulations. It was laughable. Ethan had already proved, multiple times, that his estate wasn't under HOA jurisdiction. But this wasn't about rules or regulations anymore. This was about Karen trying to break him in front of an audience. Fine. If she wanted a public spectacle, he'd give her one. The hearing was set for Friday evening at the Oakridge Community Center. Ethan arrived early, his leather folder tucked under his arm, filled with legal documents, security footage stills, police reports, and statements from other residents Karen had harassed. He had spent the last few nights preparing, ensuring that every piece of evidence was airtight. When he stepped inside, he was met with a room full of faces, some curious, some anxious, and some downright furious. Word had spread, and now, residents who had been subjected to Karen's unchecked authority had come to watch the showdown. At the front of the room, Karen sat behind a long table flanked by 2 HOA board members. She looked as poised as ever, her expression calm and confident. If she was rattled by Ethan's case against her, she didn't show it. Instead, she flashed a polite smile, the kind that barely hid the venom beneath. "Mr. Caldwell," she greeted smoothly, gesturing to a chair across from her. "Please, take a seat. Let's resolve this matter like adults." Ethan didn't move. "I'm not here to resolve anything, Karen. I'm here to put an end to this nonsense." Karen barely blinked at his defiance. "We'll see," she said before turning to the audience. "Let's begin." She started with a list of fabricated infractions, reciting them like a prosecutor laying out charges. Ethan had failed to maintain his landscaping, erected unauthorized structures, and violated community guidelines regarding property aesthetics. She even threw in a baseless accusation that he was operating a business out of his home, an absurd claim based on the fact that professional photographers occasionally rented his land for shoots. As she spoke, Ethan noticed something shift in the room. The residents, many of whom had gathered just for the spectacle, were beginning to see through her performance. Some exchanged skeptical glances, while others muttered under their breath. Even the two board members flanking Karen looked uneasy. When she finally finished, Ethan calmly unfastened his folder and pulled out his notarized property deed. Without a word, he slid it across the table. "This is my deed," he said, voice steady. "It was recorded before Oakridge even existed. My property is legally exempt from HOA control." One of the board members, a man named Mark Reynolds, picked up the document, adjusting his glasses as he scanned the text. Karen, however, didn't bother to look at it. Instead, she waved a hand dismissively. "Technicalities," she said smoothly. "The point is, your property exists within the neighborhood, and as such, it must conform to community standards." Ethan let out a humorless laugh. "Karen, you're making up rules that don't exist. And you're targeting me personally because I refuse to bend to your authority." Karen's smile faltered for just a second before she composed herself. "Mr. Caldwell, this isn't about control, it's about keeping our community beautiful and cohesive. If everyone ignored the rules, we'd have chaos." That's when Mark spoke up. "Karen," he said slowly, placing the deed down on the table, "I think we need to take a step back here." Karen's eyes snapped to him, irritation flashing across her face. "Excuse me?" Mark turned to the audience. "Mr. Caldwell's property isn't under our jurisdiction. That much is clear. If we can't enforce our rules on him legally, then why are we even holding this hearing?" The murmurs in the room grew louder. A few residents started nodding in agreement. Karen's polished facade cracked. She was losing control of the room. "Because," she snapped, "if we let people like him ignore the rules, others will follow. Then what happens? People start parking RVs in their driveways, painting their houses ridiculous colors, putting up sheds wherever they want." A man in the crowd let out a loud scoff. "Karen, I repainted my house twice because of you. And both times, you changed the rules right after I finished." A woman stood up. "You fined me for putting up a rose trellis. I had to rip out an entire garden because of you." More voices joined in. Karen's jaw tightened as the crowd turned against her. Ethan folded his arms, watching the chaos unfold. This wasn't just about him anymore. Karen had spent years ruling Oakridge with an iron fist, and now, the people were finally fighting back. When the shouting died down, Mark sighed. "I think it's clear that we need to reconsider how this HOA is being run." Karen turned to him, voice sharp with barely contained fury. "You can't be serious." Mark met her glare. "I am. And I think this hearing is over." Karen's face turned red. For the first time since Ethan had met her, she looked truly rattled. "No," she snapped. "We're not done here. We still need to." But nobody was listening to her anymore. The board members gathered their things, the crowd erupted into angry chatter, and Ethan? He simply picked up his folder and walked away, knowing one thing for certain. Karen had lost. And the real fallout was just beginning. Ethan knew Karen wouldn't accept defeat gracefully. Even after the disastrous HOA hearing, she would try to reassert control in some last desperate attempt to salvage her power. That moment came early one morning when Ethan woke to the unmistakable rumble of heavy machinery. He bolted to his window and froze. A bulldozer sat near his property line, accompanied by a crew of workers in HOA-branded vests. Panic surged through him as he rushed outside, heart pounding. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the morning air. The crew foreman looked up, startled. "We're here under HOA orders to remove the unauthorized fence and clear any overgrown vegetation," he said, reading off his clipboard. Ethan's blood ran hot. "That fence has been standing for decades. It's not unauthorized, it marks my property line." The foreman hesitated, clearly uneasy, but before he could respond, Karen appeared. She strode onto the scene like a queen surveying her kingdom, clipboard in hand, her expression gleefully smug. "This is for the benefit of the community, Ethan," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Your fence is an eyesore, and frankly, it's about time someone cleaned up this property." Ethan clenched his jaw, but instead of arguing, he pulled out his phone. "Great. Let's call the police and let them decide if you're allowed to demolish private property." Karen's smirk flickered, but she doubled down. "You're being ridiculous. We are well within our rights." Within 20 minutes, a patrol car pulled up, and Officer Vanessa Carter stepped out. One look at the scene and her expression hardened. "Let me see the legal documentation giving the HOA authority over this property," she said, arms crossed. Karen faltered. "Well, technically, That's what I thought," Carter interrupted, turning to the workers. "Pack up your equipment and leave. Right now." The foreman didn't hesitate. The crew started loading up, while Karen stood there, fuming, her face pale with frustration. "This isn't over," she hissed at Ethan. But it was. Over the next few days, the fallout was swift. Ethan's lawyer, Maddie, filed a formal lawsuit against the HOA for harassment, trespassing, and property damage. The evidence Ethan had gathered, security footage, violation notices, neighbor testimonies, was damning. The case never even made it to trial. The HOA caved almost immediately, settling out of court, paying for damages, and issuing a formal apology. But the real blow to Karen came from within. Under pressure from furious residents, Mark Reynolds and the HOA board voted to remove Karen as president. The final decision was met with cheers from the community, and in a delicious twist of irony, Karen was slapped with a series of fines herself for abusing HOA authority. Ethan sat on his porch that evening, watching the sunset over his estate. His home was safe. His family's legacy remained untouched. And, perhaps most satisfying of all, Karen had lost everything she had worked so hard to control. The war was over. But the real question is, how far would your HOA go to control you? Have you ever been targeted by power-hungry officials like Karen? Share your stories below, let's see who had it worse.